now exactly 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. I'm adopting that time frame, even though I'm here on the East Coast where it is now noon. Welcome. I'm so glad that everybody's joining me today. I know that we have a bunch of other people registered who should be joining soon. And today is the last in our scheduled series of talks, but I expect there will be more. So keep an eye on the Better Living Center for Behavioral Health webpage, as I expect we'll be rolling out future trainings in the coming months. So I'm very excited to get a chance to speak with you all today about developing imagery as part of exposure therapy. Before I get started officially, let me just mention a couple of things that I think are worth knowing with respect to this particular session today. First of all, this particular topic is very personal for me. It's actually part of what got me into treating anxiety disorders. So I'll share with you a brief little anecdote. And I think what I'm about to say tells how you never really know what direction your career is going to go. So when I was a grad student, one of the things that happened, as many of you may know if you're recalling your graduate school days, is that you hang out a lot with your classmates. You spend a lot of time with these people, sharing in the challenges and just this sheer overwhelming demand that comes with earning your doctorate. And as part of that, there's a lot of social time as well, people kind of relaxing. And so on many occasions, my classmates and I, we would go have meals together at a restaurant, kind of low cost pub slash restaurant right near campus. And on one occasion, shortly after we learned about exposure therapy for anxiety disorders, this is like circa 1991, over a meal, I started to just kind of riff about something related to the appearance of a food item. And one of my classmates said, "Wow, the imagery that you provoked was pretty intense. You should consider going into anxiety disorder treatment based on the stuff that we were just talking about." That's kind of the essence of it. I'm obviously sanitizing a little bit of this for our audience, but in any case, I actually took those words to heart, and led me down a road to where I am now, and I'm very happy for it. And so this is an opportunity to kind of formalize and really kind of think through some things that are part and parcel of how we do exposure therapy. And like I said, you'll have some parlor tricks that you can use for it. So now I got that little personal anecdote out of the way. Part two, I want to remind everybody, this talk, as with all the others that are now available that I've done over this year, dating back to the beginning of February, are available for you to view for free if you haven't already. Today's talk will draw a little bit on several of those prior talks. So there are elements that you'll see that are through lines from the prior talks up to today. So this is, I think, a good, like really a coda on the series of talks that I've had the opportunity to present with Better Living as our supporters. And now, again, for those of you who are just tuning in, if you don't know me, so I'm Dean McKay. I'm on the board of advisors for Better Living Center for Behavioral Health. It's been really a wonderful opportunity to do this with them. Just a little plug for our sponsors. They run a very impressive outfit in Allen, Texas, right outside Dallas. They have intensive outpatient, partial hospital, as well as individual and remote individual treatment for anxiety, OCD, and trauma. So, please consider thinking of them as part of your ongoing referral network. Third item, just that I think is worth highlighting, is, one of the issues with imagery that we're going to get into is a lot of different decision making that people have to make when beginning to entertain doing this. So part of our talk today will also include just understanding what are conditions where someone might be particularly receptive to having imagery be part of the treatment. All right, so let's get started. So here's my little overview of our session today. I'll have a little overview about imagery in general. talk about just briefly the efficacy of imagery in conjunction with in vivo exposure. Uh, we'll talk about assessing the extent that a client can actually engage in imagery. And to the extent that they can, we'll talk about imagery training and applying that under some circumstances that are not so highly emotionally charged. We'll talk about ways to pull in all the senses for imagery. And we'll talk about creating conditions where imagery cannot be easily avoided, which is an important thing. And I think it's an underemphasized element of how we think about imagery when we just immediately introduce it as a component of in vivo exposure. And then we'll have a summary and question and answer period. Okay, so I'm going to start with a statement. In order to maintain good immune health, humans need to be a little dirty. We need to marinate in our own filth every day. Our sheets need to baste us in our own excretions. I'm saying that because I want you to think about it. And as you're sitting here listening to this training, ask yourself, how much of that imagery did you absorb? How much did you visualize the act of marinating in your own filth, the way that I labeled that statement? We're going to come back to this statement later. So I wanted to start with basically an evocative statement intended to help us to understand how to approach imagery as part of our work. So you're going to see that quote again later. Okay, so imagery. You know, when we think of imagery, we usually think of visualizations. We usually think of the eyesight. And our eyes are a very intense, rich source of material. However, in order to really be evocative, we need to pull in a lot of other material. And so for us as clinicians, if we're producing imagery, one of the things we have to pay attention to are the full range of sensory experiences. And so we often think of five, right? Vision, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. But we often overlook the fact that we also have a kinesthetic sense, right? Our sense of balance, our sense of location in space, which plays an important role. And then pulling all of those together. So when we think about ways that we might evoke this for clients, we want to really create a scenario that the client can engage in that will feel as immersive as possible. And so it actually is a pretty demanding task to do this effectively in order for clients to really feel that they're there, which is really the whole point of it. So some client factors in imagery. So one of the things that is underappreciated is that there is an incredibly high degree of variation among individuals in the extent that they can actually get immersed in or develop for themselves a mental image. There's a concept in psychology, we actually draw it from the hypnosis literature, called absorption. And so I'll mention for a moment, I'm very science oriented when it comes to psychological practice. Absorption and the relationship it has to the hypnosis literature comes from the scientific study of hypnosis, by the way, which is something that many behaviorists were engaged in for a while. There was a time where hypnosis was a fairly common kind of procedure that was engaged in among certain sects of behavioral practitioners. And absorption required that we really assess the extent that someone could really get immersed in an image, but it was kind of a naturally occurring quality. So people arrived at the clinical setting with varying levels of this. There are some measures out there, by the way. None of them are terribly new. I have, in preparation for today's discussion, I surveyed the literature. I have not seen any new measures of absorption that have come out. The latest work that I saw on this topic goes back to the early 90s. So this is not a new concept at all. I don't know whether the research has really settled on it, but it's certainly something that has been around for a while. And if you are going to engage in any kind of imagery work, which I assume for most of us, if you're treating anybody who has anxiety, OCD, or trauma, any of those conditions, imagery plays a role. And so it is worth asking on the fly. If you don't have a measure at your disposal, ask on the fly as you're engaging in any kind of basic imagery development, the degree that the imagery is clear. Now, as you're doing that, there are a couple of things that may play a role as to whether or not the image is clear for the client. The first one is how much depth and detail do you provide as the clinician? Part two, how much do you engage the client in facilitating the imagery development? Part three is the degree that the language used by you is readily familiar to the client. Part four is to what extent does it have some language that is simultaneously familiar to the client as well as infrequently used. So keep all of that in mind, and you'll see suddenly now that the concept of imagery is not so straightforward. It's actually rather complicated, and it draws on a lot of different concepts, and you may feel the need as you're developing imagery with clients to make some corrections along the way, which is fine. Most people tolerate that quite well. You have to think about it strategically, though, in the trajectory of treatment. All right, so some training in imagery. So let's assume for a second, if we go at a very basic level, that the client that is seated before you struggles to engage with imagery. So you ask the question, how well can you imagine things? You might start with something really basic, like, hey, can you describe for me what you had for breakfast? Okay, so you ask that question. Now the client is now faced with a demand. Describe the situation. Now, as they describe it, so let's say if it were me, I'll have the hypothetical back and forth with myself. Okay, so I'm going to have a little conversation with myself for all of you. Hey, Dean, what'd you have for breakfast today? Oh, I had my usual fruit with some yogurt, and I had a piece of bread with peanut butter and jam on it. Oh, okay. Can you describe it in more detail? Now, if I'm a little bit flummoxed on how to describe that, the clinician has to then guide me. So I'm going to guide myself. Okay, so what were some of the fruits that you had? All right, well, let's see. I always had berries. So I had raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, some strawberries, the yogurt. I mixed peanut butter powder in it with dried cherries. And now the clinician might ask, all right, so you described your breakfast. Did you leave anything out? Now that you're thinking about it more deeply, have you overlooked anything? And I go, okay, let's see. Well, yeah, you know what I do? I have a bed of banana slices underneath all that fruit. And then I stir up the yogurt and put it on top of the fruit. And then I put some of the strawberry slices on top. Oh, okay. So now we're getting a fuller picture. Now, the follow-up question that we need to ask. Now, notice this is not an emotionally charged scene, right? This is a fairly neutral scene. That's good because now, as part of this training endeavor, we're drawing out ways in which this scene can be more clear, more evocative. What are some things that you smell? Oh, let's see. So I smell the coffee. Oh, wait, you didn't mention coffee before. Oh, okay, so now as we go along, we can get more and more granular in the details around what this imagery entails. And basically, as you're doing this, you're trying to occupy the perspective of the client. And so imagery is maybe the most clear phenomenological exercise that you might do as part of your work with your client. You are taking the position of trying to create an image so clear that you are sort of the visualization, full sensory experience proxy for the client. So what I've described for you so far of my breakfast, all that you picture is the food. I need to fill in the blanks for you on some other details, like what are the dishes? So they're clear glass plates with like a design on them. Where does it get prepared? Okay, so on the sink top, on the island in the center of my kitchen. What is the countertop look like? You see where we're going with this, right? The full sensory experience includes all of these elements. What is the temperature of that countertop? Oh, well, let's see. So first thing in the morning, even if it's a hot day out, it's kind of cool to the touch. What does the air feel like? How do you feel? Right? So, oh yeah, at that time in the morning, I'm a little bit drowsy still, even though I usually work out first thing in the morning, right? So we go through all of these details. So you notice that on my little checklist here on the slide, it's a desirable situation. So you might have asked me if I was your client, name a meal for each day that you particularly enjoy. Oh, breakfast. That's a desirable situation. Now, you as the clinician are probably familiar with, hopefully familiar with a carefully constructed breakfast. Remember, breakfast is the meal that gets your metabolism going. That's why it's the most important one. So hopefully you'll be able to develop and facilitate the development of this imagery for it. Notice it's a highly specific scene, right? You didn't ask me, hey, describe getting up in the morning. Getting up in the morning includes all kinds of stuff. So you picked a really specific thing. You could get even more specific, like describe one of the berries, right? Assuming that I took a close enough look at one. You can make sure that it has a low emotional charge, or at least that it's pleasant. There's a reason for that. We're going to get to that in a minute. And then you would rehearse this by including additional sensory information. Notice that what was included in this was a whole bunch of other sensory experiences. You go further with it, going to the gustatory experience and the other odors that might be present as part of this task. And then, of course, we would have a recording in order for the person who's practicing this to listen to between sessions so that they can develop a deeper and more thorough skill in being able to engage in and develop other imagery for themselves. So that's training. Now, this you might spend several sessions on it. What I described to you with the breakfast, that could be like a half hour of getting really deep into the weeds on the full experience. It goes to, washing the fruit, what kind of utensils are involved, any other things that are done during that time. If you read the paper in between, or you look at Facebook or whatever other things one might do, you would go deep, deep into those things in a highly specific, very small bore kind of way. So as far as it goes with exposure in conjunction with in vivo, as far as imagery goes with in vivo exposure, there's extensive findings that show that these two work best in conjunction, that in vivo exposure generally is greatly facilitated by imagery. But if you look at the training guides that are out there in various written works, it's not terribly clear about imagery to what. Like, what are we doing the imagery for? Do we do it for just enhancing engagement with the target stimuli? Do we do it for the feared outcomes? Which, by the way, imagery for the feared outcomes, many of you, if you do this, you're often speculating in a way that is drawing an inference based on the stimuli in hand. Or are you doing imagery associated with the cognitions? What are the core cognitions that are associated with the presenting clinical condition? Each one of these are viable potential additional imagery targets as part of the imagery that you develop in the course of exposure. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that there are many different ways to go about doing this. Each one has a different virtue in the course of how you engage in treatment for your client. So, for example, you might engage in imagery to enhance the live stimulation. I'm going to use a through line here with contamination fear. I'll tell you why I use contamination fear. First of all, I just happen to like it as a condition to target. So you're at the mercy of my preferences, everybody. My apologies. So imagery to enhance live stimuli. So here's an example where you could potentially, for any client, make almost anything the target of contamination related fear. So you see here in this picture, this is like just some lettuce. And with lettuce, if we were to focus in on it more closely, there are bacteria. So here's how the imagery might go. If you were working with a client who had contamination concerns, and they say to you that being in contact with unwashed lettuce would have a low rank of anxiety on the hierarchy, which would not be unusual, right? Lettuce as a food, client might say, "Yeah, I'm okay with lettuce. My subjective units of distress for lettuce, 20 out of 100." So then you begin to talk about how, well, the lettuce was grown out in some fields and in industrial corporate level farming in this country, then that lettuce has probably been through a variety of different machinery. And in the course of it going through that different machinery, it will probably come in contact with other other vegetables, maybe even other food products, which is why every now and then you hear about some bacteria that's not associated with lettuce getting on lettuce, like E. coli. And so, how does that even happen? It happens because the lettuce might be in the presence of other animal products where E. coli would not be unusual. The E. coli arriving because in industrial meat packing production, there's often various kinds of animal waste involved where E. coli can get on the lettuce. And so that lettuce that you're handling right now has at least some E. coli bacteria on it. And, in industrial farming, the way it is in the contemporary United States, I'm assuming everybody on is in the United States. So, with apologies if we have an international crowd. But coming back to this image, I hope now, as I'm developing it, ask yourself, how vividly can you picture a scene where the lettuce has E. coli on it? And where I was going would be even with other harmful bacteria like listeria, which comes from processed meats. And you do hear about this every now and then. There have been numerous recalls on produce in this country over the last 10 years that I can recall, where there was either E. coli or other bacteria on lettuce. Now, notice with what we're describing here, pause and get you out of the image. Those of you that are immersed in the image, let that fade. With apologies if you're planning to eat lunch shortly after this session. If you think about now what I've done there, all I did was go deeper into the content of what the person was doing exposure for. So the person arrives for the session stating that they are concerned with contaminants. You assess that they are that they have a hierarchy that ranges from things that are fairly low, in this case, routinely consumed food items, up to whatever it might be on this hypothetical hierarchy. And all you did was just enhance the kinds of things that are likely to be concerns associated with that contamination. Notice that there were no consequences. It was just the presence of the actual contaminants in the stimuli. Now, on the other hand, you could have imagery that enhances the feared outcome. So let's say same scenario, person's handling lettuce. They start out by saying, yeah, as far as hierarchies go, lettuce is pretty low. So it's around 20. Okay, now they start handling the lettuce. And you start to say things like, well, I've read in recent years it's not uncommon for there to be E. coli outbreaks that are as a result of contamination happening to lettuce. And the lettuce then unexpectedly has things like E. coli and other very harmful bacteria. And so now that you're handling that lettuce, it'll be on your fingers. And one of the things that we know is true is that our skin is semi-permeable. And so some of that bacteria may even penetrate your skin. Now, I know you usually hear that E. coli and other bacteria is something that will affect you only if it gets into your GI tract through consumption. But don't forget that it can enter your bloodstream other ways. E. coli is a particularly resilient bacteria. And so, You may have it on your fingertips. You may not thoroughly wash it away, and then you'll put your hand to your mouth, and then you'll get sick. And it won't be long before you'll need medical attention. And as part of this, eventually you'll end up possibly in the ICU. And as you're lying there, let's picture now you're in the hospital bed. And as you arrive in the hospital, they have to insert IV into your arm. You feel the needle prick onto your arm, but you're also so sleepy and like groggy and feeling so sick, and you're nauseous from the E. coli bacteria, and you feel feverish, you're shaking, and so you're eager for the medical care, but you're also now you're in the hospital setting, and in that hospital setting you smell the unique antiseptic smells that come with being in the hospital. And you even hear other people, you hear not only the sounds of the machine, you'll hear the beeping of the heart rate monitor. You'll hear what sounds like a machine that is designed to go on and off periodically to dispense medication through the IV tube that you have in your arm. And you hear the moaning of patients in some of the other rooms as you are there in the ICU. There's a nurse that comes in, she's very pleasant, very friendly, asks you how you're doing, but you're so weak that you can barely utter a word. Okay, now, as we pause, now that was a brief snippet again, but notice that the imagery is around feared outcome. I'm mostly paying attention to what happens as a result of the exposure. We're not really spending that much time on the actual stimulus. So that's a viable option that you can choose, which, by the way, in the behavior therapy literature has a long history. So I want to highlight two things on this note. One, as far as long history goes, the earliest citation of that style of exposure goes back to the late 60s, specifically by two people, Don Levis and Don Stampfel, who wrote about this in 1967. They pegged it as a specific kind of treatment called implosion therapy. And implosion therapy is where you, as the clinician, develop imagery. And by the way, they developed it as solely imagery based. There was no in vivo component to how they described it. But in that imagery model, implosion was intended to be where the clinician made a guess, basically, about the consequences. Now, in this image that I just described, I'm not using it as a guess. We would ask the client, well, what do you think is the worst thing that would happen? And then you do the image around that. By the way, sometimes clients don't know what the worst thing is that would happen. And so maybe for another time, we could talk about how to make those kind of bigger inferences without it sounding too much like other traditions in psychotherapy. But the other warning, or like heads up about this, I guess, that's worth remembering is that you don't want to go too far afield where you're making imagery for feared outcomes that resemble things that might have happened. Now, what am I getting at with this? So I chose contamination fear for a very deliberate reason. I said it was one of my favorites to treat. It also, I think, is a rich fear state for developing images. One other way in which this kind of imagery is sometimes used is with respect to trauma. And so some of you on here may recall a time where one of the issues in trauma-related therapies, particularly exposure types, were where the clinician made every effort to use imagery to guess at who or what happened to the sufferer, the trauma survivor. And so these things sometimes happen with respect to false memory syndrome. So if we think about the literature on this is with respect to making your best guess, but during highly charged emotional experiences, people are sometimes also more susceptible to developing memories that never actually happened. We don't have time to talk about all of that now, and I'll direct you to one source, an excellent source on this. It's not a recent book, but it's a good one, really solid, reads like a novel by Rich McNally, called Remembering Trauma. and he talks at length about false memory syndrome. So imagery for outcomes that are feared is an important one, but it is also one that comes with some important caveats. So I see there's a question in the chat or comment from Jennifer. And so, Jennifer, I'm going to come back to that towards the end so we can have a little chat about this, okay? Because I think this is an important one for us to get into. So I'm going to highlight a few more things here as we go along here. So another element for imagery is where you might use it to enhance or to target cognitions. So we have a litany of these that are possible for us. Uncertainty, black and white thinking, discounting the positive, perfectionism, overestimation of threat, or inflated responsibility, to name a few, that are all possible that would be targeted with your imagery. So as you're working on developing the imagery, one of the things that's happening is that you're making the cognitions more salient. So once you do the imagery exercise, so let's say if we go back to the way it was for the first one, person gets the vivid image and you're engaging with them around bacteria that might be on lettuce. In the aftermath of that, you might then also make make an opportunity to inquire about cognitions. Which ones are now relevant? And one of the things that's interesting is that sometimes clients don't have a good handle on that. It's only when you engage with the exposure that suddenly there is more thought about it. So this, by another name, is a behavioral experiment. So remember, in a behavioral experiment, what you're doing is a little bit of in vivo exposure. And as part of that, it activates cognitions. Cognitions usually, when you just talk about things that people are concerned about and there's nothing there, cognitions are what we sometimes call cold. And the imagery or the behavioral experiment plus some imagery facilitates making those thoughts hot. Hot meaning they're now more accessible, they're more relevant, they're more salient. And so let's say for our situation with the contaminated lettuce, well, now maybe a big issue is, well, how much uncertainty do you live with whenever you eat a salad? And is it worth the risk? How do you manage that uncertainty? Maybe it's black and white thinking. My lettuce is either contaminated or clean, nothing in between. So we have to reckon with that as part of the exposure. So the full sequence involves exposure and facilitating a deeper dive on the stimuli, exposure and facilitating engagement with the feared consequences, and then exposure and dealing with the cognitions that may flow forth from them. All right, so I want to go into Jennifer's question here or comment. So Jennifer highlights that she has a client who has a very vivid imagination, who's also a therapist. When she hears stories from patients whom she is assessing, she also vividly imagines the incident happening to her, and it is the source of a number of different imagined illnesses and contributes to a lot of her phobias. So one of the questions, how can I help her to not imagine that she has every illness and has every terrible catastrophe happen to her that actually happened to her patient? So this is sort of the flip side to this. Someone who has very active, very high levels of engagement, how do they create some distance from that kind of imagery? So one thing that may be worth the client doing is if she's engaged in a lot of imagery, if the imagery was just to visualize that it's words coming out of the person's mouth as if it were just on a page, rather than connected specifically to imagery. A concept that this reminds me of would be the word desensitization that we see in the ACT literature. So early on, when Hayes was developing relational frame theory concepts that were specifically tied to ACT, he talked famously about the idea of a word becoming a cue for the word rather than the word being a cue for the image. And so he would talk about the concept of milk And the word milk by itself is evocative of the substance. We think of the liquid, we think of potentially the taste. As you devote more energy to thinking about milk, you picture the carton that it comes in, a glass that it would have that would contain milk. But then if you start to just repeat the word milk over and over again rapidly for 30 seconds, the word milk is a cue for the word. It's no longer a cue so vividly for the image. And so the client may benefit from a little bit of work around that kind of desensitization so that her imagery is actually a little bit blunted. Now, this is with some advisement, given that the anxiety that the client has probably is also driving a certain amount of apprehension for a wide range of possible outcomes. If somebody has GAD, they worry sometimes about the vast unknown. And so the description here may include a whole litany of things that are just never going to be encountered. And so you would not want to have exposure for every possible scenario. It may include then trying to get a higher level way of dealing with the idea that you are someone burdened with high levels of imagination. And how do we redirect that in a way that will be productive? And part of it will include then understanding that, yeah, you know what, you're at risk, like all of us, for things happening. And you may need to be desensitized to some of the most high level things that are going to be dangerous, but we also need to try and anticipate how to manage this in an ongoing way, because after all, her career kind of depends on it. I'll have to think a little bit more carefully about this beyond that, because it is an interesting flip side to the point of our discussion today. So in evocative imagery, one of the things that you have to deal with pretty early on, so after the client gets trained in doing imagery, assuming that we have someone who's not able to imagine things so vividly, but even if they can, when we do evocative imagery, sometimes the natural inclination is to avoid it. So remember, the client that you're seeing in most cases is very talented at avoiding the things that create anxiety, or they get a little glimmer of it and then they shunt it off. That's the thing. So a lot of people who are anxious, they get a little bit of a snippet and then they block it. And so what creates all the anxiety is that it's out there. There are reminders and they're constantly shunting it off so that they don't have to go down that rabbit hole. And so because of that, when we are doing imagery development, we need to think about ways to frustrate the avoidance. So this is one of these translational areas. I mentioned at the beginning, how did I land in this area? By sheer accident. I don't know what the circumstances are that led to it, but my imagery development skills for other people was fairly fluid. And it turns out that it seems on close inspection that I had fallen into a few categories of behavior with this that seemed to have been the subjects of some examination in the linguistic literature. So one is to choose language that violates categories. So category violations is something that we generally don't respond well to. So our natural inclination is to form categories. And when we hear language that commingles categories, we have to deal with it. It's a cognitive engagement that is evocative. It has an emotional draw. And in trying to deal with it, we have to then engage with it. We can't so easily avoid it. It has to be with language that is familiar, but also with some less frequently used terms. And if you do multiple imagery exercises with clients, you have to be careful not to overuse images so that you facilitate new learning. So remember, I talked about how today's presentation draws on prior talks that I've done this year. Going all the way back to the beginning with inhibitory learning, we're facilitating new learning. The overuse of images blocks the ability to engage in expectancy violations. We're violating an expectancy, right? The prediction in talking about something is that it's going to follow a streamlined category connectivity. And if we violate that, well, then it evokes an image. It also is inconsistent with the prediction that the client has around the stimuli. And as you do more of these, you mix it up even further so that the categories get commingled. So remember my statement before. So I chose that deliberately. Notice that we use some familiar language. All of you could imagine your own bedding. The choice of that statement was also so that you could picture yourself. As you read this statement, imagine for yourself, think about for yourself the idea of being horizontal between your sheets, clean sheets ostensibly, at least to the naked eye, but where you also know full well that you are marinating in your own filth. The low frequency terms here being marinate and baste. In everyday language, we don't use that much unless you're a chef or heavily involved in cooking culture. Marinating and basting are things that you don't usually hear that much. And we have category violation. And maybe some of you snack in bed, but you probably don't marinate things or baste anything in bed. I'm hard pressed to imagine that any of you are bringing, let's say, your Thanksgiving dinner turkey up to your bedroom and marinating it and basting it while having it on top of your bedding. So these are category violations that we have baked into this very simple statement. Now, this is the kind of thing that you would work hard to construct for clients if you're trying to produce evocative imagery, one that is difficult to avoid. Now, I'm making a guess. I've used this phrase before, though, by the way, so this didn't come from thin air. My guess is that it is difficult to avoid the image of lying in bed with your own bacteria all over you based on this statement, even without my facilitating it now and being a little bit, frankly, obsequious in going into it. This is not surprising for you, probably, as we look at it. That's the task that you're faced with. So let's go through an illustrative example. So Michelle is saying when I say expectancy violation, right, no, I'm not suggesting that it have a neutral or positive outcome. It's really more, it's such an elaboration. Let me put it in a slightly different way. As you look back at this, I'll go back to this slide. So think about this statement. In order to maintain good immune health, yada, yada, yada. It probably sounds a little funny. I've rolled this statement out on other people and they usually kind of snicker at it. The category violation is so jarring that usually people have a different emotional reaction. And so I've tried this kind of thing with clients before that are vast category violations. I'll use one more, by the way, that was generated for me by a client. So outside of this, I'm being a little gratuitous with discussing terminology. So I'll give you an example that I think you'll all appreciate. That's with social anxiety. Here's a scenario. So this is back when I was doing more live in-person therapy. This is just prior to the pandemic. And I was treating someone who was a first-year college student on his summer break. And he had social anxiety, and we went to the mall. And one of the concerns he had was around wasting the time of any salesperson. As we're going there, though, he was anxious about this prospect of going to the mall with me. Now, you might not be surprised to hear that I look a considerably good deal older than the typical first-year college student. And so this guy said to me, so now that we're going out into the mall and we're going to talk to other people, who are you to me? This is what he said, which was great. I thought it was a really great observation. And he said it with like a kind of comedic air. And I said, oh, well, why don't we just say I'm like your uncle? And he goes, okay, you're my uncle. So we're in the store. We talk to somebody. He does a good job with it. He's anxious. As we're walking out as part of the cover, and in order to kind of break a little bit of the tension, I said to him, how's your aunt doing? To which he said to me, I guess you're not really over the divorce. After all, And I was like, wait, what? And he's like, well, you're asking about my aunt. And as my uncle, don't you think you would know? So, so the idea here is that sometimes the imagery, because it's so absurd, is something that becomes comedic. And so it doesn't, right, the story doesn't necessarily have to have any particular direction outcome, but one that you may take is that if the imagery facilitates a negative outcome, that the category violations are so crazy and so jarring that they provoke some kind of cognitive dissonance like reaction. So thank you for that question, Michelle. It's a great one. Um, okay, so I'll go through an illustrative example. So here's I'm sticking with my contamination fear trajectory here for you all. So the client in question, I'm not even going to bother with other demographic information because it's probably not even really that important as part of it, except that the client in question had very severe contamination fear. She was married with 3 children. One of her children had actually a medical problem in the GI tract. Okay, so that kind of sets a little bit of the stage around this. But even without that, she had contamination concerns before this issue was diagnosed. And so she was worried about poisoning herself and her family. The food of greatest concern for her was chicken. Um, now, I mentioned E. coli before, but as you know, chicken, many people are concerned about because of salmonella, which you can eliminate if you cook your chicken to a high enough temperature. You have to get it to the FDA recommended 165-degree internal temperature. But of course, for people that are really anxious about this, you can never really be too safe, and so you're better off just avoiding it. You can live quite fine without eating chicken. Naturally, for this client, it extended to other things. It wasn't just to chicken. It became a problem where she couldn't really prepare any food at all because she didn't feel that she could bear the responsibility of potentially getting one of her children sick, in particular the kid who had GI tract related medical problems. But she also really had a hard time with imagery, like in a very basic way. She had trouble visualizing things. Here was the conversation that was illustrative of how little imagery she engaged in. This is a person who had a professional degree, by the way, who had a job with a lot of responsibility. So I'm highlighting that because imagery skill and intellectual or educational attainment do not necessarily directly correlate. You can be ostensibly a high IQ individual to the extent that we agree with the concept of IQ, by the way, and the way that it's assessed in the modern era, and have really difficult times imagining things. So I asked her, well, what are the things you visualize? Assuming that everybody does like I do, which is when I'm driving by myself, I have stuff on my mind. And it's not a stream of verbal consciousness, it's a stream of visual consciousness. It's got all kinds of imagery associated with it. And I have talked to other people, and it seems that that is not uncommon. When I asked her about this, she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, what do I mean? I mean, when you're driving, what are the kind of things that you picture? She goes, I don't picture anything, just listen to music or I have a podcast on. I go, oh, so there's nothing. She goes, no. And turned out in a lot of her day, not a lot of visualization. So we had to devote some energy to just making sure that she had a baseline level of ability to engage in imagery. And we started with something that she said was a very pleasant image. Notice that unlike other times that I've done this with other people where we focused on food, stayed away from food with her because food was a problem. So we chose something that was a fairly neutral one, which was a boat landing at a national park. In particular, if you've ever been to the Everglades in Florida, there's a boat landing at the terminal end of the park. And at that boat landing, you have a lovely view of the water. And we went into some detail about waiting at that boat landing and talking to a park ranger. So we picked this very neutral scenario with a lot of different elements that drew on sensory experience, right? Standing on the landing meant standing on a dock. You might feel a little bit of wobbliness underneath your feet. The park ranger evokes certain very specific imagery. The scenery around you, so at the edge of the dock off to one side, you'd see where the beginning of the mangrove forest would begin. And so you could see the trees, and there's a particular kind of imagery associated with that. Again, if you've been to the Everglades, you know what I'm talking about. So there's a lot of different highly salient imagery. Now, for this person, seeing alligators was also not fear evoking. So we had, included alligator imagery, like highly specific, highly immersive kind of imagery. And she rehearsed this and elaborated on it. So the rehearsal was not just to train in a single image, but to elaborate on it so that the skill got deeper and more pronounced. And then as we went along, she did some other things with respect to engagement with low emotionally arousing stimuli. We then did in vivo exposure, where she came in contact with the food items that she was concerned with only, and didn't cook them, didn't eat them, didn't do anything with them, just encountered raw chicken. We started with like raw chicken cutlets and then raw chicken parts, and we moved up to ground chicken. Now, why ground chicken? Ground chicken because ground meat has more surface area, therefore greater opportunities for bacteria to form, and therefore bigger levels of stimuli engagement. We then went through in vivo imagery for the consequences to herself. Remember, she's worried about herself getting sick and her family. So getting herself sick from her own food preparation, she wasn't that excited about it, of course, but as far as subjective units of distress, probably like a 50, whereas getting family members sick, much higher, 65, 70, 75. We got into higher levels. Then imagery for consequences for her family. So that included things all the way up to her child who had medical ailment being hospitalized, and with the doctor saying to her, well, it's pretty clear that your son got salmonella and it was due to the chicken that you prepared. Could happen to anybody, but unfortunately, this is what happened, right? So the doctor is a little bit non-blaming, but nonetheless, the consequences are on her shoulder. And then, of course, this one, like the Venn diagram of overlap between these, you could see, there's some overlap here. So that consequence that I just described includes now some of the cognitions, right? That inflated responsibility is a relevant one for this client. So it covers this full gamut as part of the engagement. Now, as part of this, with the imagery for self and family, there were things that were category violations. So category violations included things like, presenting the food in settings that were inconsistent with where you would eat food. So, she's serving the food. I had it where some of the imagery was, frankly, ridiculous. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason having to do with the idea that you want to make it so that it's almost impossible to avoid. So unusual and jarring scenarios are ones that make for more vivid imagery. And that's what she needed. Remember, if she's struggling with imagery as a skill, and then she's developed this new skill that we're now going to use as a vehicle for eliciting more anxiety, well, that means we have to really violate those categories. So we'll pick places where you don't usually eat food. Standing in front of the sink in the bathroom. Going to guess that most of you, I'm not going to make any big assumptions, but I'm going to make a minor one. And that is that most of you have probably not eaten chicken in front of the bathroom sink. That's a guess. Okay. I'm not going to say no one. Maybe some of you have, but I'm going to guess most of you haven't. Or maybe in the bedroom. You don't really bring chicken into the bedroom. So we would pick settings that were inconsistent with what one would expect. Category violation. Category violations are critical in order for this to work. And so that's my view, at least. So that's how we bring it all together. So a little bit of housekeeping for us with the last few minutes. First of all, if you want to finish to get the CE survey and your CE certificate, oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong link here. You go back to the link for this presentation, not the panic subtypes one that was 2 weeks ago. So my apologies, I didn't update the link correctly. And I just want to remind you, here are the trainings that we did over the course of this year. So this was our concluding one in the series, but keep an eye out for some more in the future. I will put in one more little shameless plug here. I will do a deeper dive on this topic at the upcoming ABCT conference, with this one being a master clinician seminar titled Developing Effective Imagery and Exposure-Based Therapies. I'm going to go a little deeper into the category formation issue. Little teaser, category violations is associated with some stuff in disgust, by the way. It's a disgust-related concept, but it's transportable more broadly. And so with that, I appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much for attending. And I've allowed a couple of minutes for questions. I know I answered a couple already. Any questions? We got 6 people still here active of our much larger group of registered people who I imagine are going to watch this recording. While we're waiting, I will remind you all of the email address. If you wish to email me with any questions, I just put it in the chat. My email address is deanmckay.phd@gmail.com. I'm happy to hear from you if you have any questions about all of this, or wish me to send you any articles or any other things that I have on hand. Give it another minute in case anybody's typing a lengthy question. All right, well, hearing no other questions, again, thank you all for being here today, and I'll look forward to seeing you at a future training sometime in the future. Don't know when exactly, but we're working on some other things coming down the pipe.